This is an introduction for a continuation of the introduction of the Native American Church of the Ghost Dancers, of which I and my wife are officers. And I began this introduction yesterday on YouTube live, and these are live casts, streaming live casts. We welcome any participation in these live casts as we move forward. We're looking for a few quality members to participate in these arcane traditions, these primordial traditions of Indigenous America and all Indigenous people throughout the world. And I started yesterday by describing a little of my background. I'm personally of mixed racial heritage. I'm American Indian, Native American, and 1/4 blood quantum legally. I'm enrolled as 1/4 blood quantum, recognized by the United States government with a CDIB card and tribal card, as is my wife. She's also 1/4 blood quantum. We're both officers in the Native American Church of the Ghost Dancers. It was a church that was founded in 2007 under the American Indian Religious Freedom Act, and were recognized by the IRS. And it was founded in California, so we're also recognized as a church body by the California Franchise Tax Board, as well as being registered with the Texas Department of Health and Safety for our sacrament peyote. So we have all the legal registrations and rights of a Native American church. American Indian religions were illegal until 1978. Quite the contrary, which is generally conceived in a lot of the media as America being the bastion of religious freedom. Ironically, the indigenous belief systems and religions that came forth from the spirit of this land, that were born in the spirit of this land for thousands of years, were oppressed and considered actually illegal under the law until 1978, when a law was passed called the American Indian Religious Freedom Act, which made our religions not only legal, but we have special protections now. So just a minute. Here, I'm going to have to close these doors because I can hear you. I'll start it over again. You didn't tell me you were going to watch TV. You should tell me. Oh, God. Anyway. Sorry. My wife was, she turned the TV on. In any case, where was I? So in any case, I was just telling you a little about the background of the church. And these things happen. So in any case, my background was I'm about 70 years old, and I was raised in northern Oklahoma, which was originally Indian Territory. I was born after World War II, right at the beginning of the Korean War. And I was raised in the 1950s as an adolescent. And I was exposed to and experienced some of the Native American traditional viewpoints. And I was raised around a lot of Native American people. So predominantly the two or three things that I was principally exposed to was the Native American church traditions and the peyote church on the one hand, and the ghost dance on the other. And probably the third was Indian Masonry, Freemasonry. Now the ghost dance came in to Indian Territory in the 1870s. It was brought from two different directions. One The traditional ghost dance originally came out of the Great Basin of the Northwest, and it was brought into Oklahoma by a man named Sitting Bull, who was a Southern Arapaho in the 1870s, not the Hunkpapa Sitting Bull, but the Southern Arapaho Sitting Bull. And he later became a leader of some of the peyote church, Native American church ceremonies. So they interfaced. It was also brought after the Modoc War by Captain Jack's group that was moved into northeastern Oklahoma, the Modocs, and they were also ghost dancers from the Great Basin. So the ghost dance has a long history in Indian territory, as does the peyote church and the Native American church ceremonies. And a lot of the ghost dance leaders were also peyote church leaders, and vice versa. Peyote church leaders were ghost dance leaders. John Wilson, who was the founder of the Big Moon ceremony, was also a well-known ghost dance leader as well, for example. Indian Masonry was brought into Indian territory in the mid to early 1800s, and it was sort of a bastion of protection against the incursions of fundamentalists in Western European Christianity that were trying to repress and exterminate and ethnicize Native American culture and their religious beliefs. So Freemasonry, which came also from an ancient primordial source and was a ritual ceremonial tradition, was compatible with Native American ideology. So a lot of the intelligentsia and religious practitioners of indigenous American ceremonialism found a bastion of protection in Masonry. And so Indian Masonry was also something that kept alive the old traditions. Now, a fourth thing that influenced my thinking as an adolescent was the linguistic skills and the language of the Choctaw. I'm Choctaw, so the Southeast Ceremonial Complex. They were part of a religious area called the Southeast Ceremonial Complex. It was sort of in the southeastern states of what is the United States now. That the Choctaws originally came from Mississippi, Tennessee, Louisiana, parts of Alabama, and they're related to other Southeast Ceremonial Complex tribes, of which there are 12. By virtue of being able to speak the Choctaw language, a lot of the culture is carried in the language. So that assisted me in understanding and reflecting on a lot of these ancient traditions. So anyway, when I was about 8 to 10 years old, I had some very profound, my family had some very profound spiritual experiences that could, for lack of a better term, were hyperdimensional or otherworldly, separate reality oriented. For lack of a better term, they were like UFO experiences. We lived in a rural area in northern Oklahoma, and in the back of this rural area, there was a pond, a lake, and in the 1950s, there were a lot of stories about UFO sightings and experiences in the area where I live. Now, in the Choctaw language, this is not, in the Choctaw traditions, this is not unusual, because these hyperdimensional experiences have been talked about for a long time among the traditional peoples. As a matter of fact, there's a name for these type of UFO experiences. They're called, in Choctaw, they're called Nishkin Achafa, which means one eye. And it would be because there was this big globe or one eye. and a hyperdimensional being would sometimes come out of this one eye, and he would interact with the people, and he would give them messages and of great import. And if you didn't respect that person, sometimes for fear, what have you, there have been occurrences where this entity who would come out of the Nishkina Chafa would be disrespected, and that person would have a curse put on it because of that disrespect. So it was always, you were always taught to respect the Nishkina Chafa and the intelligence or entity that would, whether it was a hyperdimensional intelligence or usually it was a humanoid, beautiful humanoid type being that would come out of these Nishkina Chafa. And so, for lack of a better term, it was like a UFO experience. And in any case, in this lake area behind our house, we started seeing lights appear in the sky. And then we'd go out the next day, and there would be circles, perfect circles, burn in the grass, like crop circles, or like some craft that landed there. And so subsequent to that, we started experiencing lights in our over our house, and it would light the whole house up as bright as day and shine right into our bedroom. And about this time, I started sort of feeling uneasy. I was about 8 years old, and I slept in a separate bedroom. I started wanting to sleep in my parents' bedroom. So I went into one night after this happened. I was sleeping in my mother and my parents' bedroom, and this my mother woke up, and there was this blue globe that just filled the room. It was like a globe. It was almost like another dimension had filled the room, and this beautiful woman came out of this, appeared from this globe, and she sat on my mother's bed, and she started conversing with her, and she told her things about herself and about me. And I'm not saying I'm special or anything, because these hyperdimensional experiences have happened to a lot of people. But in any case, this happened over, not just once, but it happened many, many times over a series over a period of about 2 or 3 years. And sometimes I would wake up and I would be like sleepwalking in a different part of the house, or sometimes even in the back acreage behind our house. And I was somewhat bewildered about what was going on. My whole family was, bewildered by this. I was an only child, so it was just me and my family and my parents, and I had a beautiful little guard dog, and he would usually any little occurrence, he would be up and alert us to what have you, but he would stay some way in a somnambulistic kind of state of sleep throughout this whole thing. So in any case, this went on, and as this proceeded on, it stimulated. By the way, I talked about a little bit my background yesterday on the Facebook. I was homeschooled, so I didn't matriculate from grammar schools or high schools, so I was homeschooled. But I was very precocious, and about this time I became a very avid reader, and I was very interested in reading philosophical and religious texts. I also became very astute at reading mathematical text, and I studied, by the time I was 10 or 11, I could do pretty sophisticated trigonometric functions and differential equations and what have you, which served me well. When at 16, I entered the university by virtue, and I had not matriculated from high school, so I was able to score very highly on the Scholastic Aptitude Test and was able to enter major universities at 16. In any case, I was stimulated also. I was very much interested in reading, probably more than anything, spiritual and religious texts, because I was trying to work out in myself what what all these occurrences were happening around me, these unusual hyperdimensional occurrences. So one of the first books I can remember reading at 8 years old, when I started developing my reading skills, was a Masonic book by an old Mason named Manly Palmer Hall. He was, I think he was a Scottish Rite Mason as well as a Blue Lodge Mason. And he'd written a book called The Secret Teachings of All Ages. And it had a lot of this information on these primordial traditions in it. I remember we had the big book and had these color plates in it. And I used to flip through the book and look at all these color plates and read all the text about all these ancient symbols and primordial. It even had a chapter in it about American Indian traditions. So, and how they all interface in this from these ancient primordial sources. So I was very curious about that, and was anxiously looked at these pictures. I used to love to look at these pictures and try to figure out what the symbols meant. Another book I read at that time can remember reading when I was around 8, 9 years old, was a book about the Pacific Islanders in Hawaii, the Hunas of Hawaii. It was by a man named Max Freedom Long. It was called The Secret Science Behind Miracles. And it talked about how this man named Max Freedom Long, who was actually initially a Christian missionary, he'd gone there in a similar way to how Native Americans had been sent these missionaries to try to repress their ethnic traditions. He'd gone there to do the same with the Kahunas in Hawaii, but he ended up being converted to their religious beliefs because they were so astounding. Some of the things they could do and some of their practices were so deeply involved in this otherworldly, hyperdimensional spiritual context. So that's I remember reading that book. I read some books by a man named Charles Fort, who wrote about some of these some unusual hyperdimensional disappearances, appearances of he wrote a book called Woe and a book called The Damned, I think it was. I forget the actual, but his name, there's a society, the Fortean Society, that was formed around all this information that he collected. He would collect this information from news reportings of all these different, very unusual experiences that happen on these haunted, hyperdimensional experiences that would happen on the planet. And this obviously struck a chord in me because I was trying to ferret out all these unusual events that were occurring around me and my family. So I was interested in reading that. I also read a book of channeled material. I can still remember what the book looked like. It was a big green book. It had gold lettering on it called OASAPHE. I think it was written by a man named Wing Anderson or Newberg. I forget his actual name. And he had channeled material about beings from another galaxy that had come here, and there was a hierarchy of beings that were interacting and overseeing what was going on this planet. And in order to harmonize with this, he tried to get in touch to this channeled material. And he I think he lived in the South, in New Orleans or somewhere, and he got a group of children that were sort of wastrels or orphan children of all different nationalities and races. And he was sort of moved to gather these children together, and he took them, I think it was to New Mexico, and he formed kind of a community based upon some indigenous Aboriginal principles. One of the things I remember, he said you shouldn't have a community of more than 3,000 people, because if the community grows too large, you lose touch with the spiritual import of interactivity with the peoples in the community. I think that's one of the problems today. the communities have grown way too large, and there's no real brother and sisterhood in the communities anymore, because the communities are just outlandishly too large, and people on top of people, and there's so much ethnic diversity and adversarial confrontations in the society. It's just not appropriate for harmony. The old Aboriginal societies, by the way, the old hyperdimensional societies, the old indigenous people societies, most of them are matrilineal clans, and now we have this male-dominated hierarchy that's very exploitive. Whereas the old societies were usually matrilineal clan systems that were very nurturing, and they were tied to this nurturing quality of the mother principle, which we don't have anymore, because it's basically a male-dominated patrilineal society, which involves establishing these dynasties of a few elitist individuals, and then the rest of the rank and file is kind of in a subservient fashion. You have your median level functionaries, but the rank and file is basically in a serf or slave level class, and that sort of goes against the old indigenous people's ideology of nurturance rather than exploitation. So in any case, getting back, I'm getting off the track, getting back to my original story, getting back to the story. So in any case, these occurrences happened over a long period of time, over about 2 to 3 years, many times. And subsequently, my mother became very ill, and about 4 or 5 years later, she passed away. I also became very ill, and I still have scars on my body from some of the things that happened at that time. And after that, about age 13, I ended up moving to California, and I started attending several things happened when I first moved to California. One of the things that happened is I started studying martial arts, because I was always a good athlete up until the time I became sick. So I started studying martial arts with Japan Karate Association in 1964. Another interesting thing that happened was that I can remember at that time was I experienced one of the first civil rights uprisings in Watts, the Watts riots, which was a social civil rights uprising. That happened in 1965, right after I came to California, and I was living adjacent to that area, just north of there. And I actually, my family was interested in seeing what was going on, so we actually drove down into the Watts area, and it was. Even though there was all this rioting and burning and looting going on, I felt relatively safe, and I can still remember the police had drawn a line, and they were, when we entered in the north area of Watts, they were sitting on, it was like about 20 police officers sitting on this bench, and then we drove on down and viewed it. But that was the first civil rights advocacy confrontation that I experienced. I remember that. Another thing I can remember is very interesting was I went to one of the first UFO conferences out at Giant Rock, given by a man named George Van Tassel out in Landers, California. And he was a man that professed to be having interactions himself with these hyperdimensional extraterrestrial beings. I think the being he said he was interacting with was an entity called Solgando. So he had organized a UFO conference in 1964 out at his airport, at this airport where he was an attendant. He was the main administrator of this landing strip out in the desert, out at this place called Giant Rock. And I went out there, and there were several people gathered around this giant rock, and they had a couple of speakers. One of the women that spoke there was from Spain, and she had interactivity herself, abduction interactivity. She came over, and they'd go up on this giant rock, the top of this rock, and they'd speak to the people, and then you'd ask them questions and you interact with them. That was one of the things I can remember in 1964 when I first came to California. Subsequent to that, I entered the University of Southern California, USC, and I started because I never really studied Judeo-Christianity in depth, but I knew it had a profound effect upon indigenous people's traditions. I thought it behooved me to look into it a little bit more thoroughly. So what I did was there's one other thing. When I was 8 years old, during these occurrences, I also started studying astrology. And that had a profound effect on my early youth. And my mother and I started studying astrology, and we got an old ephemeris and a table of houses from the society, which consequently was here in California, from the society called the Rosicrucians, and it was put out by this man named Max Heindel. He put out a table of houses and an ephemeris. And we started casting horoscopes and looking to astrology, and that later impelled me to start investigating these different calendrical systems that were these old calendrical systems that we utilize today in the Native American Church. We don't go by the Gregorian calendar. We primarily go by the 260-day calendar, the 360-day calendar, the 584-day Venus calendar, and we go by the solar lunar calendar. Primarily, our basic calendar is a solar lunar calendar of 12 calendar months with one 13th month, an intercalary month, to bring the solar and lunar calendar into alignment. And I'll go more into that, how that works in subsequent lectures and why that works the way it does. But in any case, going back to my entry into USC, when I went to USC, I spoke Choctaw. I still speak Choctaw. When I perform my ceremonies in the Native American Church, I perform them in the old primordial language of Choctaw. And a lot of these ancient indigenous languages, they have inflections and aspects that have been lost in these postmodernist languages. And a lot of the culture and traditions you can winnow out by being able to speak these languages. One example of this is when I started studying Judeo-Christianity, I thought it behooved me to look into studying the languages that the documents were written in, the original documents. So the New Testament and the Septuagint were written in Koine Greek, this Greek of Alexandria, his empire. But the Old Testament, which was even more fascinating to me, was written in Hebrew, biblical Hebrew. So there was an annex to USC that had just started at that time called Hebrew Union University. And so I started taking classes in Hebrew there, as well as Koine Greek, but I had a lot more facility with the Hebrew language. And I found there was a very close compatibility between Choctaw and Hebrew. Some of the words are exactly the same, which just fascinated me to no end. And I came to the conclusion that in the ancient past, maybe 13,000 years ago, at the time just before this worldwide flood that's talked about by all the ancient traditions, that there was an ancient red race, a primordial red race, that possibly some of the people from ancient Egypt and eastern, the upper Euphrates area where these ancient Hebrew people came out of, and some of the peoples of the Southeast ceremonial complex were from an ancient red race. As a matter of fact, the term for this ancient race in the Hebrew language is Adam, which means red man, and coincidentally, the term for the Indian territory was Oklahoma, which also means red man or red people. So this ancient red race, I'll talk more about that in subsequent lectures. There seems to be different peoples around the earth that have residues of that ancient red race in them, one of which is these peoples from the Mississippi Valley, I think, and in the Americas in general, Turtle Island, and some of them from certain peoples from the North Africa and the Middle East, I think, also have a similar residue of that ancient red race in them. And I'll tell you why I think that is the case in subsequent lectures. And it has profound implications for what's going on the planet now. But in any case, this is just a basic introduction. If anybody's interested in this, please contact us. If not, then so be it. And I won't continue on with any more of this information. We're not looking for a lot of quantity. We're just looking for a few quality people to interact with, because I think some of the information that the ancient traditions have is very important for today, because what happened in the past has to do with the prophecies of the future. And we're living in very, very dynamic times since 2012. Since 2012, we've had an 8-year period here to 2020, and that 8-year period is the cycle of Venus. There's 584-day cycles, which is eight years. In 2012, there was what was known as the transit of Venus, and it sort of kicked off this fourth cut, what the Mayans called the time of the fourth KATUN. The KATUN is 20 years. So from 2012 to 2032, it's the KATUN of the age of turbulence. It was the age where the return of Quetzalcoatl was prophesied, and it takes about 256 years for each round to take place. Each round, 13 of these 360-day cycles of 20 years to take place, and 2 of these cycles ago was 1519 when Cortez came to the Aztecs, and then if you go forward another 256 years, you hit 17. I think it's the French and Indian War, when a lot of the turmoil and the decimation of the Native Americans, not in Mesoamerica, but this time in the United States and Canada, took place. And now we've come full cycle again. Well, now the Native Americans and the red race aren't so much imposed upon, because they've pretty much been genocided and exterminated. But I think the bulk of humanity is being kind of recategorized as Native Americans, and it's being visited upon them. And there are reasons for this. And I'll go into this in further lectures, why this is happening, why I think this is happening. Again, this is my perspective. It has to do with my visions and my relationship with the spirit of peyote, who gives me messages when I enter into those visions with him, those vision quests with him. And if you have interest in this material, please contact us. And I would welcome you participating and joining our organization, and participating in ferreting out what the meaning of these very dynamic times we're living in. So in any case, Yakoke, that means thank you in Choctaw. Nayahoshishnoashke, may you walk in peace, and good luck.